This is a joke, right? Someone laughed when the woman in a janitor's uniform stood up and said she would represent the old man. The courtroom that morning smelled faintly of floor cleaner and old paper, the kind of place where people assumed they could tell who mattered within seconds of looking at them. And Evelyn Carter had learned long ago how quickly judgments were made. She stood near the defense table, her gray work jacket neatly buttoned, a ring of keys clipped at her hip, her posture straight but unassuming, while Robert Hale sat beside her with his hands folded, eyes lowered, looking exactly like what everyone had already decided he was, an old man who had run out of luck. Laughter rippled through the benches, soft at first, then bolder, as a well-dressed attorney on the opposing side shook his head with a smile that carried no concern at all. The judge raised an eyebrow, surprised but not yet annoyed, and asked if the court was serious about proceeding this way. Evelyn answered calmly that she was, her voice steady, clear, and unhurried, and that single detail alone caused a brief hesitation, though no one acknowledged it. To the gallery, she was still just a janitor, the woman they had seen for years pushing a yellow mop bucket down these same halls after hours, wiping fingerprints off doors, emptying trash cans left behind by people who never noticed her face. What they did notice now was the contrast, her plain clothes against the polished suits, her lack of credentials spoken aloud against the heavy binders stacked on the other table, her quiet presence against the confidence of people who believed the outcome had already been decided. Robert shifted in his chair, his shoulders slightly hunched, a man in his late 70s whose life had been reduced to a few paragraphs of accusation and a neat summary of what others claimed he owed, and Evelyn placed a folder gently in front of him, a small, deliberate gesture that steadied him more than words could. The opposing attorney objected almost immediately, citing procedure, decorum, and common sense, and another wave of amused murmurs followed, because the idea of a janitor arguing points of law felt absurd to them, something that belonged in a story, not a real courtroom. Evelyn listened without interruption, her eyes moving slowly from the attorney to the judge, then briefly to the clerk, as if taking inventory of the room, and when she finally spoke again, she did not argue credentials or demand respect, but simply asked for permission to address the facts as they had been presented. The judge, perhaps out of curiosity more than fairness, allowed it, warning that the court's patience was limited, a statement that drew a few knowing smiles from the audience. Evelyn thanked him and turned slightly, not to the jury box, but to the documents already entered into record, her finger resting on a date printed in small, official type, and she asked her first question in a tone so ordinary it barely registered as a challenge. It was a question about timing, about when a certain transfer had occurred, and the opposing attorney answered quickly, confidently, without checking his notes, because it was a detail he believed did not matter. Evelyn nodded, as if satisfied, then asked another question just as simple, about a signature, about who had been physically present that day, and again the answer came easily, dismissively, the kind given when no trap is expected. Around the room, attention began to shift, not because anything dramatic had happened, but because the laughter had stopped, replaced by a subtle awareness that something was unfolding at a pace no one had anticipated. Robert lifted his head slightly, watching Evelyn now, his eyes following her movements as she moved from one document to the next, never rushing, never raising her voice, building a quiet rhythm that felt less like an argument and more like a story being laid out one piece at a time. The judge leaned forward, the amused detachment gone from his expression, and even the clerk paused her typing for a moment, sensing the change in air. Evelyn remained exactly who she appeared to be, a janitor in a courtroom, but the room itself was beginning to realize that appearances had already misled them once that morning, and whatever they thought they were watching was no longer a joke. The courtroom settled into an uneasy quiet as Evelyn Carter continued, the earlier laughter replaced by a tension that no one openly acknowledged, and she remained standing beside Robert Hale, without touching him, yet positioned close enough that her presence felt intentional rather than symbolic. She asked permission to clarify a sequence of events, and when. The judge nodded. She began to walk through dates and locations with careful precision, naming streets, offices, and distances measured in miles, as if she had memorized them through repetition rather than study. The opposing attorney glanced at his notes, still relaxed, because none of what she said challenged his argument directly, and that was what made it unsettling. Evelyn spoke about routine actions that sounded harmless on their own: paperwork delivered, forms signed, records filed, the kind of administrative steps that happened every day in buildings like this one. And as she spoke, the court clerk followed along, pulling files that had already been entered but never examined closely. Robert sat very still, his breathing slow, his gaze fixed on the table in front of him, a man who had spent months being spoken about instead of spoken to, and it showed in the way he flinched slightly each time his name was mentioned aloud. Evelyn did not rush to defend him, nor did she describe his character or his age or his history, because she understood that sympathy was fragile and easily dismissed, especially in a room that valued efficiency over empathy. Instead, she focused on consistency, on how certain details repeated themselves in the record without explanation, how signatures appeared identical across documents supposedly signed weeks apart, how addresses were listed that Robert had not lived at for more than a decade, and she asked the simplest question of all, whether anyone had verified those details in person. The answer, spoken reluctantly by a witness called earlier in the case, was no, and that single word landed heavier than any accusation could have. Evelyn nodded once, thanked the witness, and turned back to the judge, who was now listening with his hands folded, his expression no longer neutral but intent. The opposing attorney objected again, this time with less confidence, arguing relevance, but the judge overruled him, allowing Evelyn to continue, and a murmur spread through the gallery as people adjusted in their seats, sensing that something foundational was being questioned. Evelyn asked about access, about who had physical control of certain documents at specific times, about office hours and security logs, and when she mentioned a maintenance schedule, a few heads turned toward her instinctively, as if remembering where they had seen her before. She did not acknowledge that recognition, but it worked in her favor, because it framed her questions as practical rather than theoretical. She spoke of doors unlocked early in the morning, of lights turned on before staff arrived, of filing cabinets opened after hours, details that sounded mundane until they formed a pattern, and the clerk quietly confirmed that cleaning crews did have access during those times. Robert finally looked up then, his eyes meeting Evelyn's for a brief second, and she gave him a subtle nod, not reassurance but alignment, as if to say that what mattered was already in motion. The judge asked her to clarify her point, and she did so without hesitation, explaining that opportunity was as important as intent, and that the court had been presented with a story that assumed accuracy without questioning access. The opposing attorney shifted his stance, his earlier amusement gone, and he requested a brief recess to review materials, but the judge denied it, stating that the court would proceed while the record was open. Evelyn accepted that decision with a calm acknowledgement and returned to her questions, now directing them toward a timeline that placed Robert miles away from the location where key actions were alleged to have occurred, citing bus routes, travel times, and receipts that had been dismissed as irrelevant before. She did not raise her voice or dramatize the contradiction. She simply laid it out, step by step, allowing the court to do the arithmetic on its own. By the time she finished, the room felt smaller, as if the walls themselves were listening, and the laughter from earlier seemed distant, almost embarrassing, because it was now clear that whatever assumptions had been made about the woman in the janitor's uniform had nothing to do with her ability to see what others had overlooked. As Evelyn Carter finished laying out the timeline, the judge called for the next witness, and the shift in the courtroom was unmistakable, because the confidence that had once belonged entirely to the opposing side now hovered uncertainly in the air. A middle-aged records supervisor was sworn in, her voice tight as she answered questions about filing procedures, and Evelyn listened closely, allowing her to speak at length before intervening. When she did, her questions were not confrontational but methodical, guiding the witness through her own processes, asking how often documents were reviewed, who had clearance to move them, and whether deviations were logged, or simply assumed to be harmless errors. The witness admitted that many tasks were delegated, that trust played a role, and that not every action was documented in detail, which prompted Evelyn to ask whether trust was a substitute for verification in matters involving property and legal authority. The question hung in the room longer than expected, because it was framed as curiosity rather than accusation, and the witness answered carefully, conceding that it was not. Evelyn thanked her and returned to the evidence table, selecting a single page that had been previously dismissed as redundant, and she asked the court to note the condition of the paper itself. It was slightly worn, the edges softened from handling, unlike the pristine copies that followed it, and she asked when the original had last been physically inspected. No one could say. Robert shifted again, this time leaning back slightly, his posture changing as if the weight he carried was beginning to redistribute, and Evelyn noticed without reacting. She then asked the clerk to confirm the timestamps on electronic submissions related to the case, and as the clerk read them aloud, a discrepancy emerged, subtle but consistent, showing activity during hours when the office was officially closed. The opposing attorney objected, arguing that maintenance access had already been addressed, but Evelyn responded by clarifying that access did not explain authorization, and the judge allowed her to proceed. She described how systems often assumed legitimacy based on proximity, how familiarity could replace scrutiny, and she spoke plainly, without embellishment, about how routine environments bred oversight. The gallery was silent now, not because they were captivated by drama, but because the logic was inescapable, and several people found themselves mentally retracing their own assumptions. Evelyn requested permission to submit an additional item, a log sheet from building maintenance that showed entry times and badge usage, and when it was displayed, a pattern aligned with the earlier timestamps. She did not claim wrongdoing outright, but she asked the court to consider whether the narrative presented so far accounted for these overlaps, and whether Robert Hale, who relied on public transportation and lived nearly 20 miles away, could reasonably have been responsible for actions occurring simultaneously in two locations. The judge leaned back, his gaze moving between the screens and the attorneys, and he asked the opposing side to respond. The response was measured but strained, focusing on intent and precedent, yet it lacked the ease it once had. Evelyn listened, her hands resting loosely at her sides, and when given the chance to reply, she spoke briefly, stating that intent could not be evaluated accurately when opportunity was misattributed. She then turned toward Robert, asking him a single question about his daily routine during the period in question, and he answered quietly, describing bus schedules, waiting times, and the physical limitations that made his days predictable. His voice was steady, but the room felt the vulnerability in his words, not as a plea for sympathy, but as a statement of fact. Evelyn did not elaborate on his testimony, instead allowing it to stand alongside the evidence she had already presented. The judge called for a short pause, not a recess, but a moment to review the materials now highlighted, and as he did, several people in the gallery exchanged looks that carried a shared realization that the case they thought they understood was no longer intact. Evelyn remained standing, composed, her expression unchanged, while Robert closed his eyes briefly, as if bracing himself for the outcome, whatever it might be. When the judge resumed, his tone was different, more deliberate, and he instructed both sides that the court would need to reconsider certain assumptions before proceeding further. It was not a ruling, not yet, but it was enough to confirm that the balance had shifted and that the woman they had laughed at had altered the trajectory of the room without raising her voice or asking for recognition. When the court resumed its focus, Evelyn Carter did not advance immediately, allowing the silence to settle long enough that everyone felt its weight, and in that pause the earlier confidence of the room continued to erode. The judge addressed both parties with measured caution, indicating that certain foundational claims now required clarification, and invited Evelyn to proceed if she had further material relevant to the emerging discrepancies. She acknowledged the invitation with a brief nod and returned to the evidence table, selecting a slim folder that appeared almost unimpressive compared to the thick binders stacked nearby. She explained that the folder contained records that had been overlooked because they were considered secondary, not decisive on their own, yet when placed in sequence they offered context the court had not been given before. She began by referencing a set of utility statements associated with a property tied to the dispute, noting average usage patterns measured in kilowatt hours and water gallons per month, figures that established a baseline of occupancy. She then contrasted those figures with a sudden spike that coincided with the period under review, asking whether the court found it reasonable that such a change would occur without anyone noticing who was present at the property during those weeks. The opposing attorney objected again, suggesting speculation, but Evelyn clarified that she was not offering conclusions, only inviting the court to examine correlations already documented. The judge allowed it, instructing her to continue but remain within the scope of established facts. Evelyn complied, pointing out that the increased usage corresponded with dates when Robert Hale was documented elsewhere, traveling across town on fixed routes that took significant time, and she reiterated distances in miles and typical travel durations that made overlap implausible. Robert listened quietly, his expression still reserved, but there was a subtle steadiness in the way he sat now, as though the narrative no longer pressed down on him alone. Evelyn then addressed the court regarding familiarity, explaining that repeated exposure to the same environment often created blind spots, especially when people assumed they knew who belonged and who did not. She spoke about how certain individuals moved through buildings unnoticed precisely because they were expected to be there, and she framed this observation carefully, without referring to herself directly, allowing the implication to form on its own. The judge watched her closely, his eyes narrowing slightly, not in suspicion but concentration, and he asked whether she was suggesting that presence had been mistaken for authority. Evelyn responded that she was suggesting presence had been mistaken for permission, a subtle but critical difference, and the room reacted with a collective intake of breath that no one acknowledged. She then requested that a final document be displayed, a maintenance request form bearing initials that did not match any authorized personnel on record, and she asked the clerk to confirm whether those initials appeared elsewhere in the system. They did, attached to after-hours access logs that had been previously categorized as routine. The opposing attorney stood again, his tone sharper now, arguing that the court was being led toward inference rather than proof, and Evelyn accepted the challenge calmly, stating that inference was unavoidable when facts were selectively isolated. She reminded the court that her role was not to dramatize but to restore continuity, to show how pieces dismissed as insignificant formed a coherent picture when viewed together. The judge called for the witness who had overseen access credentials during that period, and when the witness admitted under questioning that temporary badges were sometimes issued without full verification due to staffing shortages, the reaction in the gallery shifted from curiosity to discomfort. Evelyn did not press the witness aggressively, instead thanking him for his honesty and returning her attention to the judge. She concluded her presentation by summarizing the unresolved gaps without attributing motive, emphasizing that Robert Hale had been positioned as responsible in a scenario where opportunity, access, and timing did not align with his reality. The judge took notes, his pen moving slowly, deliberately, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried a gravity that had not been present earlier. He stated that the court would need to reevaluate the evidentiary weight assigned to the claims against Robert, and that further proceedings would reflect this reassessment. It was not an exoneration, but it was a decisive shift, and the gallery understood it as such. Evelyn stepped back from the table, her role in that moment complete, while Robert exhaled quietly, the tension easing from his shoulders just enough to be noticeable. The room did not applaud or react outwardly, but something fundamental had changed, because the assumptions that once governed the space no longer held, and the woman who had been dismissed at first glance had redefined the narrative through patience, precision, and an unyielding commitment to what the record actually revealed. The judge announced that the court would proceed with heightened scrutiny, and the atmosphere shifted again as if an invisible line had been crossed, because what had begun as a formality was now clearly a reckoning. Evelyn Carter remained composed, but she adjusted her stance slightly, turning her body toward the judge rather than the opposing counsel, signaling that the focus had moved from argument to examination. She requested permission to address one remaining aspect that had been referenced but never explored, and when granted, she began speaking about records that reflected responsibility rather than accusation, emphasizing that accountability in complex systems often failed not through malice but through neglect. She explained how oversight weakened when familiarity replaced diligence, and how individuals who operated quietly in the background often carried knowledge that never made it into official reports. The judge listened without interruption, his attention fixed, while the opposing attorney stood rigid, hands clasped, the ease he once displayed fully gone. Evelyn referenced a prior audit conducted several years earlier, one that had flagged procedural inconsistencies but resulted in no changes, and she asked whether the court was aware of its conclusions. The answer was no, and she provided the reference number, allowing the clerk to retrieve it. As the document appeared on the screen, the language was unmistakably cautious, recommending review rather than assigning blame, yet the parallels to the current case were difficult to ignore. Evelyn pointed out that the same weaknesses identified then were evident now, and she asked whether it was reasonable to isolate responsibility to a single individual when structural issues had been documented and ignored. Robert Hale sat quietly, his hands resting on his knees, his gaze forward, no longer shrinking from the proceedings, but not seeking attention either, a man whose life had been disrupted by processes he never controlled. Evelyn continued by addressing the timeline of enforcement actions taken against Robert, noting how swiftly conclusions had been drawn once paperwork aligned, and contrasting that speed with the years it took for prior warnings to be acknowledged. She did not accuse the system of intent, only of imbalance, and she framed her words carefully, understanding the resistance such statements often provoked. The judge interjected, asking whether she was implying institutional failure, and Evelyn replied that she was highlighting institutional blind spots, a distinction that mattered. She spoke about how systems were designed to prioritize efficiency, sometimes at the expense of accuracy, and how individuals like Robert, who lacked visibility and resources, were often the first to absorb the consequences. The opposing attorney attempted to redirect the discussion towards statutory obligations, but his voice lacked conviction, and the judge allowed Evelyn to finish. She then introduced a brief account of Robert's efforts to seek clarification before the case escalated, referencing letters sent, calls made, and appointments missed due to administrative delays, all documented but previously dismissed as irrelevant. As these details were read aloud, the narrative surrounding Robert shifted subtly, from passive subject to active participant who had attempted, unsuccessfully, to engage with a system that did not respond. Evelyn did not dramatize his frustration, nor did she embellish his persistence. She simply allowed the record to speak, trusting that its cumulative weight was enough. The gallery remained silent, not out of politeness but recognition, because many present understood how easily such efforts were overlooked. The judge asked Robert directly whether he recognized the correspondence displayed, and Robert answered affirmatively, his voice steady, explaining that he had kept copies because he believed records mattered, even when responses did not come. Evelyn acknowledged his statement with a slight inclination of her head, then returned her focus to the judge, stating that the court now had before it not only inconsistencies in evidence, but a broader context of procedural neglect that demanded consideration. The judge nodded slowly, signaling that he understood the implication, and he announced that the court would require additional review before proceeding further, citing the need to ensure that conclusions rested on verified facts rather than assumptions. It was a measured response, restrained but meaningful, and it confirmed that the direction of the case had fundamentally changed. Evelyn stepped back once more, her role again receding into quiet presence, while Robert released a breath he had been holding, the tension in his shoulders easing just enough to be visible. Around them, no one laughed, no one whispered, and no one looked at Evelyn Carter as merely a janitor anymore, because the room had learned, through methodical exposure rather than confrontation, that credibility did not announce itself through appearance, but through the patience to reveal what others failed to see. The court reconvened with a restrained formality that felt heavier than before, as if every person present understood that the process had moved beyond appearances and into consequences, and Evelyn Carter stood once again beside Robert Hale, without drawing attention to herself, her stillness now read as control rather than uncertainty. The judge addressed the room, stating that before proceeding further, the court required clarification on one final matter that had emerged implicitly through the testimony, and he invited Evelyn to respond. She acknowledged him respectfully and began by addressing responsibility not as an abstract concept, but as a sequence of decisions that either protected or failed individuals who depended on the system to function correctly. She spoke about how Robert had lived within predictable limits, budgeting his expenses carefully, tracking mileage on public transportation, and organizing his documents with a precision born from necessity, rather than training, because when resources were limited, order became survival. She explained that these habits were evident in the materials already submitted, from neatly dated envelopes to handwritten notes that aligned precisely with official records, and she asked the court whether such consistency suggested negligence or carelessness on Robert's part. The judge listened, his expression thoughtful, and did not interrupt. Evelyn continued by addressing the issue of benefit, noting that throughout the timeline presented, there was no measurable gain for Robert from the actions he was accused of, no increase in income, no improvement in living conditions, no deviation from the modest patterns documented over years. She contrasted this with the administrative convenience of assigning responsibility to a single individual rather than examining systemic gaps, and she framed it not as criticism, but as an observation grounded in efficiency-driven practices. The opposing attorney attempted to counter by referencing statutory presumptions, but his argument felt procedural rather than persuasive, and the judge allowed Evelyn to finish her statement. She then turned slightly toward Robert and asked him, with permission from the court, to describe his understanding of the situation when notices first arrived. Robert spoke plainly, explaining that he had assumed an error, that he had trusted it would be corrected once reviewed, and that he had followed instructions exactly as written, even when they conflicted, because he believed compliance would lead to clarity. His words were calm, free of resentment, and they resonated because they reflected a faith in process that had not been reciprocated. Evelyn did not expand on his testimony, instead redirecting attention to the broader implication that individuals like Robert often bore the weight of procedural failures simply because they were visible and accessible. The judge asked a final question, whether Evelyn was prepared to disclose her basis for assembling such detailed records, and the room grew noticeably still. Evelyn paused briefly, then responded that her familiarity with the building, its routines, and its unspoken rhythms came from years of observing what others overlooked, and that proximity, when paired with attention, created understanding. She did not elaborate further, nor did she assert authority, but the implications settled across the courtroom, reshaping perceptions without announcement. The judge nodded slowly, acknowledging the answer, and stated that the court would take the matter under advisement, citing the need to correct potential misapplications before rendering any judgment. It was a deliberate statement, careful and restrained, yet it carried weight, signaling that the presumption against Robert had been fundamentally undermined. Evelyn stepped back, her hands relaxed at her sides, while Robert remained seated, his expression unchanged but his posture subtly eased, as though the burden he carried had shifted from certainty to possibility. The gallery remained quiet, not out of obligation, but respect, because the process unfolding before them demanded it. As the judge adjourned the session pending review, there was no dramatic reaction, no audible relief or protest, only a shared understanding that something irreversible had occurred. Evelyn gathered her papers with unhurried precision, returning them to her folder, and as she turned to leave with Robert, no one laughed, no one whispered, and no one questioned her place in the room, because credibility had already been established, not through declaration, but through the disciplined act of revealing what had been ignored. When the court reconvened for review, the atmosphere was no longer cautious but intent, as if every person present understood that the final shape of the case was beginning to emerge, and Evelyn Carter entered the room with the same quiet presence she had maintained throughout, though now every movement drew attention without her seeking it. The judge opened by summarizing the points under reconsideration, outlining inconsistencies, access gaps, and procedural oversights that had altered the court's perspective, and he stated plainly that assumptions previously treated as settled could no longer stand. Evelyn listened without reaction, her hands folded, her gaze steady, while the opposing attorney adjusted his notes with visible restraint, the confidence he once displayed replaced by careful calculation. The judge invited final clarifications before the court moved toward resolution, and Evelyn stepped forward, not to add new evidence, but to connect what had already been established. She spoke about continuity, about how each fragment presented over the previous sessions was not isolated but part of a single chain, and she reminded the court that when links were examined individually, weakness was easy to miss, but when aligned, absence became unmistakable. She reiterated that Robert Hale had been evaluated as a convenient conclusion rather than a verified cause, and she framed this not as an indictment of intent, but as a consequence of procedural momentum. The judge nodded slowly, and for the first time since proceedings began, he addressed Robert directly, asking whether he wished to add anything before the court proceeded. Robert stood with measured effort, his voice even, and said only that he had trusted the process because he believed truth did not require force to surface, and that he was grateful for the opportunity to be heard rather than assumed. He did not speak of hardship or loss, and his restraint carried more weight than emotion ever could. Evelyn remained beside him, neither prompting nor guiding, allowing his words to stand on their own. The opposing attorney responded briefly, acknowledging the court's concerns while attempting to preserve credibility, but his statements relied heavily on procedural language rather than factual contradiction, and the contrast was clear. The judge asked a final question that shifted the room completely, inquiring whether there was any direct evidence placing Robert at the center of the actions alleged, given the revised context. The silence that followed was long and unbroken, and in that pause, it became evident that what had once been implied as certainty no longer existed. The judge leaned back, reviewing his notes, then looked up and stated that the court could not sustain conclusions built on incomplete verification, and that responsibility must be reassigned pending further investigation into procedural failures identified. It was not a dramatic declaration, but it carried a gravity that rippled through the gallery, because it confirmed that the narrative had been overturned. Evelyn did not react outwardly, but Robert exhaled slowly, a subtle release that signaled relief without celebration. The judge continued, stating that immediate actions taken against Robert would be suspended, and that corrective review would be initiated to address systemic gaps that had contributed to the case. The opposing attorney accepted the ruling with a tight nod, while several observers exchanged glances that reflected a shared realization of how easily credibility could be misplaced. Evelyn gathered her folder, her movements deliberate, and as she turned to leave with Robert, the court officer opened the aisle without hesitation, a gesture small but telling. No one laughed, no one whispered, and no one questioned her presence now, because the room had recalibrated its understanding of authority. As they walked toward the exit, Robert paused briefly, looking around the courtroom that had once reduced him to an assumption, and then continued forward, his steps steadier than when he had entered. Evelyn walked beside him, her posture unchanged, as if nothing about her role had ever needed validation. Behind them, the judge called the next case, the machinery of the court resuming its rhythm, but the impact of what had occurred lingered, because everyone present had witnessed the moment when appearance lost its power and careful attention rewrote the outcome. The days following the court's decision unfolded quietly, without headlines or spectacle, yet the impact of what had occurred continued to ripple outward in subtle ways, and Evelyn Carter understood this better than anyone as she walked beside Robert Hale down the courthouse steps and into the late afternoon light. Outside, traffic moved steadily, engines humming, pedestrians passing without recognition, and the ordinary rhythm of the city resumed as if nothing remarkable had happened inside those walls. Robert paused near the curb, taking in a breath that felt different from the ones he had taken for months, and he thanked Evelyn in a voice low enough that only she could hear, not with emotion, but with sincerity. She acknowledged him with a slight nod, reminding him that the process was not yet complete, that resolution often arrived gradually, and that patience was still required. Over the following weeks, administrative reviews progressed methodically, records were re-examined, and actions taken against Robert were formally reversed, restoring access to resources that had been restricted and correcting entries that had defined him unfairly. Each notification arrived by mail, stamped and dated, and Robert opened them carefully at his kitchen table, noting how different the language felt when assumptions were replaced by verification. Evelyn remained present throughout, not as a constant figure, but as a steady point of reference, checking in when clarification was needed and guiding Robert through correspondence without drawing attention to herself. At the courthouse, conversations changed in tone. Staff members who had once passed Evelyn without acknowledgement now greeted her politely, some with curiosity, others with a respect they did not fully articulate. She accepted these shifts without comment, continuing her routine with the same precision she always had, moving through hallways, observing details others ignored, because attention had never been something she turned on or off. Robert's life began to recalibrate, slowly, predictably, as routines returned and uncertainty eased, and he resumed his habits of careful planning, measuring distances in miles, tracking expenses, and organizing documents with renewed confidence. One afternoon, he returned to the courthouse alone to submit a final form, and as he waited in line, he noticed how easily people were categorized at a glance, how assumptions still formed before words were exchanged. He understood now how close he had come to being permanently defined by such assumptions, and the awareness stayed with him. Evelyn watched these changes from her position within the building, noting how procedures were adjusted, how access logs were revised, and how oversight mechanisms were quietly reinforced, not because of blame, but because visibility had been restored. She knew that systems rarely admitted fault openly, but they adapted when exposed, and that adaptation was its own form of accountability. Months later, when the review concluded, a brief notice was issued confirming that prior actions had been taken in error and corrected, the language neutral and restrained, yet definitive. Robert read it once, then folded it carefully and placed it with his other records, not as a symbol of victory, but as proof that accuracy still mattered. He returned to his daily life without celebration, finding comfort in predictability rather than recognition. Evelyn continued her work, her role unchanged in title but transformed in perception, and she did not correct anyone who spoke to her differently, because she understood that change was most lasting when it was unforced. The courthouse remained what it had always been, a place of motion and judgment, but within it, a quiet recalibration had occurred, one that reminded those who worked there that authority was not inherent to appearance, and that diligence required humility. For Evelyn, the experience did not alter her sense of self, because she had never measured her worth by how she was seen, only by what she noticed and preserved. For Robert, the outcome restored more than access or record. It restored the simple assurance that being careful, consistent, and patient still had value in a system that too often overlooked those qualities. And as life resumed its ordinary pace, the lesson remained embedded in routine rather than memory, carried forward not through retelling, but through small adjustments that ensured what had been ignored once would not be ignored again. In the months that followed, the courthouse returned fully to its familiar rhythm, yet traces of what had unfolded remained embedded in routine rather than conversation. And Evelyn Carter moved through those corridors with the same measured pace she always had, aware that attention now followed her in ways it never had before, though she neither sought nor acknowledged it. Robert Hale resumed a life that felt smaller but steadier, his days once again structured by bus schedules, grocery lists, and neatly labeled folders that occupied a single drawer in his apartment, each document placed with care, not out of fear, but reassurance. Occasionally, official letters arrived confirming adjustments, corrections, and acknowledgments written in careful language that avoided apology, yet carried finality, and Robert read them slowly, understanding that clarity, once restored, did not require repetition. Evelyn observed these developments from her quiet position within the system, noting how procedures were followed more deliberately, how signatures were double-checked, and how questions were asked that had once been skipped, because processes, once exposed, rarely returned fully to ignorance. One afternoon, as she emptied a waste bin outside a conference room, she overheard a junior clerk explaining to a colleague why access logs mattered, referencing a case without naming it, and Evelyn allowed herself a moment of stillness, recognizing the subtle permanence of that exchange. She finished her work and continued on, because her role had never been about recognition, only continuity. Robert visited the courthouse once more, not for a hearing or form, but simply to retrieve a copy of a finalized record, and as he waited, he watched people enter and leave, each carrying their own assumptions, their own quiet anxieties, and he felt no urge to correct them, because he understood now that truth often required patience rather than insistence. When Evelyn passed by, pushing her cart, their eyes met briefly, and Robert nodded in acknowledgement, a gesture that carried gratitude without obligation. She returned it with the same restraint, because neither of them needed words to affirm what had been resolved. Time continued, unremarkable yet precise, and the system adjusted in small ways that would never be attributed to a single moment or person, yet those adjustments endured. Evelyn remained where she was, attentive, observant, continuing to notice what others overlooked, because attention was a habit she had cultivated long before anyone found it remarkable. Robert settled into his routines fully, his sense of self no longer defined by defense but by stability, and he spoke of the case rarely, not out of avoidance, but because it no longer occupied his present. When he did think of it, it was not with bitterness or triumph, but with a quiet acknowledgement that accuracy had prevailed, even if slowly. The courthouse, like all institutions, continued to move forward, absorbing lessons without announcement, adapting without ceremony. And those who worked within it carried on, some aware, others simply compliant with new practices that felt indistinguishable from common sense. Evelyn ended each day as she always had, returning her keys, storing her supplies, and leaving the building after hours, unnoticed by most, yet no longer invisible to those who understood how closely she watched. Her life did not change in title or position, but her presence lingered in the recalibrated habits of the place she maintained. Robert lived quietly, comfortably within his means, content with predictability, and when he organized his papers, he did so with the assurance that order still mattered. Neither of them spoke publicly of what had happened, because resolution did not require an audience, only permanence. And in that quiet continuity, the lesson remained intact, not as a story retold, but as a system adjusted, a life restored, and a truth that no longer needed defense, because it had finally been allowed to stand on its own.